called a TriCaster, which is like a studio in a box type of platform, which is different than a lot of people these days are using.
It's not necessarily the TriCaster is complicated. We're restreaming, and we
It's all the
often
stream stuff. Yeah.
yeah we have to wait.
Yeah,
Uh,
through
yeah.
through a platform called Wowza. So
All right,
that's what
we're ready to go here.
Todd and Rob in the afternoon.
Afternoon delight.
With Todd and Rob. Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the New Media Show. We're back again on Wednesday, back in the saddle. Rob, welcome to the show.
It's great to be back, Todd, doing the show. This is it's going to be a fun episode. We get to talk a little deeper, get into the weeds of some podcast advertising stuff and kind of the latest and greatest trends
but
that are pushing the industry forward. No question.
But you know the best part?
Yep.
We're still here. We didn't get fired.
We didn't get fired. Right. So we navigated those waters successfully. Is that what you're saying, Todd?
I think so. There was a few Twitter comments that came back to us, and I saw you handle those on social media. I let you navigate that landmine, so it was good.
Right. Go ahead, Todd.
But anyway, no one loves us this week on Satoshis. We got no boost. So those of you that are watching, if you're using the Podcast 2.0 app and want to boost us, we'll talk about it during the show. But yeah, it was kind of disappointed. We didn't get any. Guess no one thought we were boost worthy last week, and it is what it is. But why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest today?
Yeah, we're lucky to have Mr. Dave Hanley on, who's the longtime founder and CRO now of AdvertiseCast, who's a colleague of mine, or is part of Lipson now. And I thought it would really be great to have Dave on to kind of help us kind of dig a little deep into what's happening, like I'd mentioned earlier, about the changes in the industry around programmatic advertising. And I know, Todd, you're all in on this now as well, and thought, getting us all together to talk about this at a deep level. And I know that the Sounds Profitable folks are all over this, and a lot of people are really focused on this area as an opportunity for all levels of podcasters to potentially, monetize their podcasts. And I know, Todd, you and I have always said that that's not always the main goal of podcasters, is to make money from their show, but a lot of the reason why that hasn't been possible is because of kind of limitations in the infrastructure of the advertising side of podcasting. But I do think, and I don't know, Todd, we'll dive into it deep, but I think those opportunities are growing and expanding, hopefully in a positive way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did forget to mention, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. I actually went to the mailbox for the first time in a couple of weeks, and we want to thank Edible Honesty for sending us a sticker for our sticker board. So, Joe, thanks for that. We'll make sure we get that on the sticker board here. But I apologize. I went to the mailbox, and it's been in there a couple of weeks. But anyway, we continue. Anyway, welcome to the show.
Yeah, Dave.
Thanks,
welcome.
guys.
Yeah.
Excited to be here. I know you guys always say if you listen to the New Media Show, you get an MBA or a PhD or whatever is in podcasting. I got into the podcast universe back in 2017, and one of the main kind of resources for me was the show, to learn all about what's going on in the podcasting world. So I have one of those MBAs or PhDs or whatever you want to call it, because I've been a long time listener. So it's great to be here.
Yeah, I would say so. Building the company that you've built and being a resource to all levels of podcasters for many years has been, it's really boosted the industry and really taken the whole advertising side of podcasting to a whole nother level. And I definitely appreciate that. But yeah, so as far as, your perspective, Dave, on this, I mean, where do you think we are, that lead in that I talked about at the beginning of this? So is that how you're seeing the market for podcasting shifting, or are you seeing something else happen that maybe I'm not seeing?
Yeah. I mean, So when I think back to, again, kind of the early days of when AdvertiseCast got started, our main focus was host read ads.
Right.
And back then, I think that was most advertising companies' focus in the podcast world, because that was really all we had, right? And when we first got into the space, it was host read and it was baked in ads, and that was really all we had to sell. Somebody calls us up, how does this work? Well, the host does the ad. They're talking about last night's football game, then they go right into their ad about HelloFresh, and it was very simple. And part of the role that we played then was to kind of educate people around what they need to know about podcast advertising that's different from other channels that they advertised in, like broadcast and social media and that type of thing. And what we thought back then was that some sunny day, someone's going to call us up and say, hey, the majority of people that call us up are going to say, I know all about podcast advertising. I've done it before. And we don't have to take that educational, kind of stance. But then what happened, of course, is that the world of podcast advertising got a lot more complicated. Dynamic ad insertion, companies start selling, different types of ad units and packages, mid-rolls, pre-rolls, dynamic, episodic, full catalog. The whole advent of IAB certified platforms versus non-IAB certified platforms versus platforms that say they're IAB compliant, but they're not certified.
Right.
And then, because I was kind of new to media altogether, I was doing a lot of kind of reading and research back then about, like, how did this work in other, kind of emerging media channels? And really what I kind of found out was, whenever a new media kind of comes about, the scrappy, really, aggressive advertisers come in. Generally speaking, they're direct response advertisers. They figure out the channel, they exploit it to get really, really good. And maybe exploit's the wrong word. I
think it's the good word.
Yeah, I think it's the right one.
To the maximum to get their ROI. And then, of course, other people find out about it that aren't, the typical, advertisers that are going to jump into a new media, and then they enter the space. And I think that over the last year to maybe 18 months, I think that's what's been happening, is a lot of bigger brands are going, geez, HelloFresh is getting a really good return on investment over here, it seems, and there's a lot more visibility, and then bigger brands start to come in. And now I think the big difference between the direct response kind of scrappier marketers and the bigger brands is, the bigger brands want to control the message a little bit more. They don't want to necessarily have a host, talk about their product any way they want. As you guys have talked about many times on your show, is some good examples of just crazy ad reads that are going way off the reservation, and the hosts kind of get in trouble, but then they kind of don't, because it still generates a great ROI for the advertiser. Right. I don't think the big brands want to deal with that for the most part, and so I think that's why we're seeing a lot of momentum in more the, I'm going to use air quotes here for people that aren't watching, programmatic advertising. And really, when you think about programmatic, it's pre-produced creative, it's targeted across many, many shows, typically kind of an audience or certain demographics. And I think that's really what the bigger brands are gravitating towards. And I think that's what we're seeing in terms of that shift. And that's what's really driving things. And so, it seems like most companies like us, and, Blueberry's doing the same thing. Libsyn just announced the same thing. Other platforms are really, tapping into that to be able to give podcasters some more options in terms of monetizing their show. And that's kind of where we're at today.
It's one of those things where, we worked really, really hard to try to bring the advertisers that were doing direct response and host read ads back to the smaller shows. But it just, it seemed to me like I was just pounding my head against the wall, talking with media buyers. And of course, and then every, 18 months, the position changed, and you had to do that education all over again. And I don't know if there's still a lot of that going on today or not. Hopefully it's, we're past that point. But I think that from what we've observed so far since we've introduced Programmatic, and we've been testing with our partner SoundStack now for about 4 months, and then released just before Podcast Movement to the entire Blueberry community, was we just wanted to see what the quality ads were, and then what the CPMs were running, and getting a handle on that to see, where the low point was, where the high point is, where the median is going to be, what the fill rate's going to be. And essentially at this point, I think we've got a pretty good handle on where those numbers are and what the fill rate's going to be. And I'm pretty pleased with it, I guess, from that standpoint, being that it's just a click a button and you're on. You don't really have to do anything more. You don't have to think. You don't have to go through meetings. You don't have to send them product. You don't have to, do follow up on how bad or good their ad was. You don't have to give them a link to put on their website for a call to action. You don't have to have a promo code. All this stuff that we'd have to do with a host, and it just makes it easy for a content creator that's focused on growing, just to be able to say, okay, I can turn. Now, if you get to the bigger point, don't get me wrong, those host read ads are super valuable and very profitable for the content creator, but for the average podcaster that's starting out today, and be honest with you, I think Anchor kind of set the bar on this, because we were watching what Anchor was doing when they launched, and they were mostly advertising Anchor on other Anchor shows, which, there was some other ads in there, but the CPMs that people were reporting to us were horrendous. And we thought, okay, the CPM levels have to be somewhere where it's tangible, so that the podcaster actually ends up with a decent check, after when everyone puts their hands in the pie, because, you've got the delivery platform and whatever that percentage of take is. My goal was to try to make sure that the podcasters still end up with 70% of that revenue from that advertising buy in their pocket, so that we didn't cut the pie too many times. And with programmatic, you can do that. You can take me as a host, I can take a less cut because I'm not doing any work.
Right.
It's just a number now for us. But at the same time, we got administrative work and that type of thing we have to do. But the attitude of podcasters has changed completely. Those that want to monetize can, and we don't have to, search for months to try to find them an advertising spot that's host read, and then all the pain that goes with it.
Yeah.
Well, it's so funny, Rob, you mentioned it, because we see a few kind of use cases around who is really gravitating towards programmatic. Number one is kind of backfill. So a show that does host read ads, they want to, let's be realistic. Like, most shows don't sell out every single, host read spot they have. So they go, okay, well, we only sold 2 out of 3, mid rolls. We'll put a programmatic spot in there. We'll get some revenue, lower rate, but it's still something, right? And then we see shows that are essentially, kind of, they don't hit the threshold where an ad buyer is typically going to pick them up on a host read, and then they can monetize on that. But it's really funny where we have some shows that are actually quite large, and they're doing host read ads. They're making, I don't know, literally tens of thousands of dollars a month, primarily on host read. But as the programmatic has grown, they're like, this is pretty nice. Like you said, even if they're making less dollars in terms of the actual CPM, the comment to me has been, it's so easy, and the fill rates are really good, and the CPMs aren't that bad.
No, they're not that bad.
And they're thinking like, man, it's actually not a bad idea just to go 100% programmatic, just based on the effort.
So one thing I'd like to be able to do at some point is, I know that you guys publish on a monthly basis what or Libsyn or whoever's making that report, what your average CPMs are for host read. It'd be nice to start, and maybe I can get SoundStack to agree to this. Maybe at some point we'll be able to show the average on what programmatic is from a CPM standpoint, so that we get that compare and contrast.
Yeah, for sure.
But
that makes a lot of sense, Todd, because I think the perception in a lot of cases is that programmatic, and honestly, we try not to even use the word programmatic because it's like a 4-letter word for some people. I think the perception is that the rates are like, low single digits, when in fact, partially it depends on where is it a post roll, is it a pre-roll, is it a mid-roll, what's the length?
Right.
Those are variables. But we're seeing programmatic rates in the 10 to 15 range in a lot of cases, and when you're selling a host read ad for, I think our last average monthly report was maybe around 23 something. I mean, it's not that big of a difference. And then the other thing with programmatic is it's a lot easier if you have a show that does a lot of back catalog. You're opening up the entire catalog. It's quite easy to monetize everything, not just your new episodes. So when you run the numbers, there's a lot of cases where the two aren't too far off in terms of the potential revenue.
And I think too is what we've seen is similar CPMs, although I'm being very careful in setting expectations and saying, here's the low and here's probably what the high is. And we've been saying 5 to 15. Now, we don't want to see too much 5. We want to see more stuff over 10 and closer to 15. That's what we want. But we know that depending on the time of day, depending on the region, depending on the ad, you may, if someone's downloading that show or play at 2:00 in the morning on the West Coast, you might not get the best ad at that time, because it really is kind of almost, podcasting has been kind of shoehorned a little bit into the programmatic ecosphere.
It's digital audio, essentially,
Yeah. So I think that what we're going to look for is that average. What's that average going to be for that show? And because in the end, ultimately what we want to do is we want to write checks, and we want to give the content creator, and I've talked about this on the show already, and actually Tom Webster actually coined the phrase. So let's see if I can do this here.
Don't eat me, Tom Webster.
We want to make sure that for the smaller shows, this is a bridge. It's a bridge to get them to the point where maybe they've grown their audience big enough to where there is a desire for someone to come in and do a host read and get that $23 or $25 CPM. Over time, we'll see what happens. But it's one thing's for sure is you don't have to spend time going to New York or to LA or to San Francisco or to Dallas to explain to a media buyer what programmatic is. They just buy it. They know what they want to target, and they go from there, and the computer buys the show. So at least that's what we're seeing.
Yeah. So one of the things you mentioned there, Todd, which it's an interesting phenomenon that I think we've seen specifically on some of the, say, smaller shows that have kind of opted in for the programmatic, is that when they see that first payment, it's the first time they've ever made money off their podcast. It's the first time they think about, what if my show was bigger? And I start to think, what if I take some of this and I put it into promoting my show and growing the show and marketing the show? Because that becomes a little bit of a cycle where they go, hey, if this is what I'm getting now, what could it be if I was 2, 3, 4, 10 times the size? Which is kind of interesting. I wasn't expecting to see much of that, but it's I guess it's human nature, right?
Do we think that over time we're going to see all podcast advertising head towards the dynamic ad insertion programmatic type of paradigm, and that the baked-in host read will eventually disappear from the market?
Well, based on statistics, 90% of shows, and again, this goes back to the beginning of time of podcasting, 90% of shows doesn't matter. They burn their 90% of the lifetime downloads in the first 96 hours. So if it's baked in, so what? Very few people are going to hear that episode 2 years later. It's going to be ones and twos. But so I think for some shows it makes sense. For some shows, you definitely want to do a host read ad inserted because you want to resell that inventory next month.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, really the only people who benefit from baked in host read ads are the advertisers.
That's right.
And in most cases, the direct response advertisers, because they're getting that long tail where, somebody's listening to a true crime podcast 6 months later and they hear that ad.
Right.
If you talk to a lot of the brand advertisers, that's a foreign concept for them. They don't want that ad in there 6 months later, right?
Right.
Because the messaging has changed, the offers changed. Hearing a Black Friday ad in April makes no sense. So, I mean, to some extent, I think definitely the baked ins are already starting to go a little bit by the wayside. I mean, we still have quite a few shows where they do offer baked in ads. It's simple. The direct response advertisers love it, so it keeps them really interested in buying those shows. But at some point I do see it, and I don't know when that's going to be. I don't know if it's going to be a year, 2 years, 5 years from now. But I do see them kind of going away at some point, Rob.
Yeah, but I go back to the viability and expense of doing programmatic baked in or programmatic ad inserted. Let's just use that word, or no, not just ad insertion. They're just doing regular ad insertion, not doing programmatic.
Right.
I've had customers call me and say, hey, we need to do ad insertion. We want to upgrade our account. And I go in and look at their data, and I almost talk myself out of dollars, because it's like, well, and it really, you can see it in their metric data. Now, on the opposite token, there are shows I'm like, my God, how come you haven't been doing ad insertion all this time? Because we've just left literally tens of $1,000s on the floor.
Yeah.
So it can split two ways.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of the model that we use when we're looking at when a show comes to us and says, "Hey, we want to monetize," and let's say it's the size of a show that it makes sense to do host right ads for. We always look at every case individually. Like, if it's a news show that people are listening to that show and today and tomorrow, and then that's it, there's no advantage to doing
None.
Dynamic ad insertion. Just do it baked in.
Yep.
Now, the strange part about it is that from an ad buyer's perspective, they see that as more valuable because it's baked in, even though there's literally almost no opportunity for back catalog traffic anyway. So it's a bit of a, it's kind of a bit of a packaging game. And like you said, Todd, sometimes we'll look at a show and that's been doing baked in and we go, you're getting a massive long tail on these. No wonder advertisers love you, but you're also leaving some potential dollars on the floor. But I do think there is, a lot of shows don't realize that when they go from baked in to dynamic ad delivery, that their CPMs are going to go down, because the secret, the kind of the dirty secret out there is if that show was getting, an extra 30% of impressions in 6 months, the ad buyer was basically banking on that, paying a $25 CPM and really getting something in the teens. Well, if it goes to dynamic ad insertion and that's capped, the ad buyer needs to get something in the teens to get the same ROI. So you really have to kind of run the numbers to say, am I going to get many more monetizable impressions at a lower CPM where it actually makes sense? Because I think some folks are thinking, oh, I can just go to dynamic, charge the same CPM and make all kinds of more money. And generally speaking, that's not the case.
And part of that mindset too, and I'm going to be kind of honest here, and it pisses me off quite honestly about media buyers, is they're like, oh, I want to buy 2 episodes this month. And I'm like, oh man, we're just killing your ROI by just doing 2 episodes in a month. And let's say it's an 8 episode a month show and they want to buy 2. And I'm like, no, let's buy 2 months and do full fill, and then let's get some real ROI out of this buy. But oh no, we want to just do 30 days. And I'm just like, it's your money. And I've often said that media buyers are a little bit short-sighted in the true long-term value of running in a show more than a couple times a month. But again, there's a dynamic there too. That show has to have a growth curve from an audience standpoint to be able to support that. If that show's not growing and is flat, then, running for 2 months is probably, you're going to run it for 2 months, probably get the most you can out of that, and it's going to burn that advertiser out for a while. So, I guess there's more than one way to look at it, but
it's a delicate balance.
It is. I mean, the whole question of frequency and duration of campaign and the repetition, right, of a particular ad are all kind of like part of the art versus the science, but it can be driven by actual metrics, right, of what's working and what's not working. And that's I think where we kind of get into this area of science needs to drive a lot of this is us not overloading audiences with too many ads. Because I do see, and Todd and I have talked about this a lot on the show, about ad load starting to rear its head mainly in big shows. But those big shows drive a lot of audience, which is giving the larger group of potential listeners out there the impression that advertising is maybe overloaded in podcasting. And so while that's not really the case, because those ad buys are not wide across thousands of shows, they're only buying across a few hundred big shows that are overloading with ads and giving audiences the impression that there's too many ads. So Dave, I mean, what's your thought on that? Is there talk in the industry of basically establishing some I don't know if standards is the right way, or guidelines on frequency and ad loads and things like that? Are we coming together as an industry, or is this kind of just a wild, wild west still, you think?
Yeah, it's a good point, Robin. I mean, what we've been kind of having an uphill battle with for, years, because generally speaking, we have some larger shows that we work with, but we also have a lot of kind of mid-sized podcasts that are really great shows, really great audience. And our point has always been, when a new advertiser comes into the space, the first thing they do is try to get on the largest podcasts out there. And the lion's share of those dollars, like the net new dollars that are coming into the channel, are going to the bigger shows. And unfortunately, what's happened is that the ad loads have gone up on those bigger shows. The effectiveness has gone down because for a number of reasons. Number one, the more demand means the rates are going to go higher. They're probably dynamic ad inserted spots. And let's be honest, the host is getting bombarded with advertisers. They're probably picking up their paper and doing the ad read, and that's it. When you go to kind of like, you go down the line, one level, you've got these mid-sized hosts where they might have, a handful of active advertisers in any given month. They want to try the product. They want to talk about it. They want to share it on their social. They want to, do a great job for the advertiser. So they drive those renewals, because renewals are huge. There's a ton of value there. And in general, there's less demand, so the rates might be a little bit more reasonable. So, I mean, that's the battle, kind of that we've been fighting. And recently we've seen, some shows coming our way that are like, hey, we want to work with you guys. And, we've been talking to some other networks and rep firms out there, and here's what they're saying they could generate for total revenue. And we kind of scratch our heads and we put it in our model and we go, hey, that seems like a lot. And then they reveal that, they're going to go from, a pre-roll and 3 mid-rolls and a post-roll to 2 pre-rolls, 5 mid-rolls, and 2 post-rolls. And we're like, I wouldn't recommend that.
Right.
There's, as much as we love making money, we also love not alienating your listeners and making them all leave. So there's that balance where it's like, take it right up to the line where you're going to add, if you put one more ad in, people are going to start to roll their eyes, and then just back it off just one. That's kind of our, unofficial recommendation. And we have some guidelines that, I think it's even on our website. It's like, if your show is this length, here's what we recommend. And we try to keep it, on the low side. We don't want it to turn into, I saw this article the other day. Radio is like, I don't know, 7 minutes per 30 minutes or something like that. I forget what the stat was, but it's pretty wild.
Yeah. It's like my tech show. I learned very early on the audience on a 70-minute show would handle 2 of my host reads, which are longer than 60 seconds. And a third, man, they would get pissed off, and I start seeing the numbers drop. And so I really kind of learned early on where the breaking point was for that show. And, now that we're running on that show, we're running a pre-roll that's programmatic and then a baked in, seem to have no issue with the audience, and everyone seems to be pretty happy. They're even telling me who's advertising. So it's kind of fun to, the audience giving you that feedback. Hey, I heard an ad from so-and-so. Don't know if they're reacting to it, but at least they're getting, I guess we want to call it earball recognition of who's actually running ads on the program.
Yeah, and I think the other thing we're seeing, which is helping in terms of the acceptance of programmatic, is that I think there's been a needed mindset shift from the creator's perspective, where obviously on host read ads, like you're kind of putting your name on this product when you're talking about how much you love HelloFresh or that you use BetterHelp and it's a great service. But when it comes to an ad for, Toyota being inserted into your show, like that's not necessarily you telling your audience that you love Toyota. It requires a mindset of like, hey, it's a TV program. The commercial break comes on, you see an ad, and the show's back on. And I think that's starting to happen. But definitely, the more we dig in on the programmatic side, the more you see that there is definitely, like you were mentioning before, Rob, some kind of like standards, guidelines. Like there are those guidelines out there in standards, but let's be honest, not everybody adheres to them.
Right.
Is everybody who's flighting a programmatic ad on a DSP putting in the proper IAB advertiser category code? I wish they were, because it would make our lives a lot easier, but they're not. And so sometimes things sneak through that somebody opted out of that ends up in the show, and it's like, hey, why was this ad for McDonald's in my show when I opted out of the fast food category? And I don't know if we should chalk it up to like, malice or just incompetence in terms of what's happening on the buyer's end. But it's kind of that's a tough challenge, and I'm hoping that'll kind of get cleaned up over time.
I think when it happens, it's closer to the end of the month, and people have went in and changed some of their tags a little bit, because all of a sudden we see stuff popping into shows that was not, that's where we've seen is closer to the end of the month where people are trying to get their budget spent, the advertisers. So I think that we've been pretty, at least us, and he's on Starlink, so he may have lost his signal, so he'll probably be back. There was that Starlink drop.
That wasn't my internet, actually.
Oh, okay.
I couldn't hear you guys all of a sudden, and I had to I had to log back in. Sorry about that.
So I think that what we'll see ultimately is if everyone puts the hammer on these vendors, and every time they do that and say, hey, you're hurting us, don't do that, and maybe put them in the penalty box for 30 days. I know that SoundStack's been pretty aggressive. We had one that slipped through that was basically a hotel chain, had 6 hotel chain ads, and then the last 2 were casino related, and they didn't mark those last 2 casino related. So all of a sudden someone's heard of gambling, which we had excluded as part of our initial launch. And did they go in and change it later, or did they just oversight on the person that was setting up in the DSP if they were, did they not mark it correctly? So I know that they had a pretty good talk with that particular vendor, and it won't happen again, hopefully. But another thing we see too is we see sometimes Spanish ads sneak through into markets that would not necessarily, it's not necessarily bad where they're being delivered, Southern California, Texas, a lot of border states. So it's not necessarily a situation where it was a wrong ad to had, but it was definitely an English show with a Spanish ad. So we see a little bit of that as well. And I tell my audience, I said, if your audience doesn't get mad, chalk that up as a freebie. You just made some money for free. So
exactly. Yeah, I think in some of those cases where you say you might get a Spanish ad, and you're an English listener, in some of those cases, I think that might be due to just bad targeting. A lot of these demand side platforms have the ability to target based on essentially device graph data, where it's like somebody's in market for an automobile, or they're shopping for auto insurance, or they're a Spanish language speaker. That data, as great as it sounds and as useful as it is from a sales perspective to go out there and sell advertising, it's not perfect by any means.
Right.
But that could be part of the issue there. But we're looking at some solutions now around, hey, do we transcribe the ads that come through and match them up against a category to see like, hey, did somebody put a political ad and mark it as restaurants? Because that's not great, right? And we want to be able to find that out before it becomes an issue.
Well, if I think the transcribe piece is smart too. We've just recently added the ability to have closed captions. So what we're seeing is those shows that have ads in them, that throws the transcription off because we've already time hacked it, and then all of a sudden we throw a 30-second pre-roll on. So what we opted to do is we're not actually going to do the highlighting of the whenever there's an ad there, we're not actually going to highlight the closed caption anymore because it's not true follow along. It'll still be there. The wording will still be there, but the follow along as it plays will not. So it's just that it's one of those things that you just kind of like, okay, little by little we'll figure this out, and maybe at some point we'll be able to even have closed caption for the ads. They do in regular television and on most other stuff. So why can't we have it?
Yeah, so I was just gonna kind of mention something else here too. Like we were talking about before, how we're shifting away from host reads, right? And one of the strengths of host reads, and we've talked about it a little bit here, is the personal nature of it. It's the endorsement nature of that has always produced good ROI for the advertisers. Is that host endorsed? But as we move into programmatic and as we move into probably more and more, we're going to move away from the host actually reading those ads. How do you think we can still embrace that personal nature of the ad in programmatic, in the dynamic ad insertion, still kind of retain that in the ad that actually historically has produced that strong ROI, and that gets back to ad content, right? Ad creative.
For sure.
Is there any movement that you're seeing, Dave, and Todd also on this, of the agencies really taking that into consideration when they produce spots?
Yeah, I definitely don't think. Yeah. I don't think host reads are going away. I just think, from our perspective, if you look at our business, like the host reads are still the lion's share of our ad revenue, and they're going to continue to be for the foreseeable future. But what's going to happen is that programmatic piece, I think, is going to accelerate faster, just in terms of like a percentage year on year. And at some point, it's going to start to get to the point where it's kind of leveled out, and who knows, maybe surpass it at some point. And I think this is almost like a bigger point, Rob, and this is one of the things that, at Podcast Movement, at the Sounds Profitable session, somebody was talking about, the kind of the programmatic ad creative, and the mistake that a lot of buyers make is like, oh, I got this great radio spot, let's just pop that in there, and that'll work just fine. And we spend so much time, as media people, optimizing targeting and optimizing frequency capping and optimizing this and optimizing that, and then we have bad creative. It falls apart. Right. There's a huge opportunity for somebody to put together a creative agency that only focuses on podcast ads. And I think somebody mentioned that, at that session in Dallas. It's like, if you could just focus on that, go to the brands and say, don't use your radio spots. We'll come up with something that's like, even though it's not a host read ad, it fits the, it's like informative, educational, integrated. It almost comes across as like the ideal ad for me in terms of podcast programmatic is you can't tell whether this is an ad that's inserted by some third party system or whether it's the show or like the network that did like a producer read ad. When you hear an ad on, I don't know, Vox or NPR, where it's like not the host, it's somebody else, and you go, oh, it's probably like somebody who like works for that network. It's a producer. That to me is like an ideal creative format, and I think should be something that buyers should really, really focus on, is the creative side.
But there's never a budget for creative.
The radio side too. It could help the radio side of the equation as well. Right.
Yeah, look, what about like celebrity endorsements? There's a crazy idea. That's been going on in TV and radio for, how many years? I think that's a great idea for podcasts.
Yeah. Todd, go ahead.
I just, we had worked on some of this in the early days, and I know maybe things have changed, but, the creative that was coming across in the actual reads was just horrible. So, we would spend time and get that creative right for the actual host. And sometimes it was more talking points than it was actual, hardcore read. And, we really spent a lot of time on that. And, that was time that I had to take out a hide. And it was not necessarily because we were small. So it was, it wasn't insequential amount of, how much am I worth an hour or whatever to do ad copy, So I think that you're right. I think there's a great opportunity out there. But oftentimes, at least before, you used to hear, well, there's no budget for creative in audio. Now, there's plenty of budget for creative in television because they got to shoot an ad, but they don't take the same, in my opinion, they don't take the same value of the ad they're going to push on TV and they're going to put on radio or podcast. So I don't know. I don't know if we can change that mindset.
Yeah, I mean, right now, what we do in terms of, if somebody comes over and they want to run a campaign, if it's like a produced spot, we try to spend some time with them. We're not, by any means, creative geniuses, but we'll try to spend time knowing what we know about podcast advertising, helping them with the copy. And then there are some, kind of like studios that you can work with that'll produce a spot at a reasonable cost, a couple hundred, a few $100s. And it's good quality. But it doesn't have, it doesn't have to cost $10,000. I mean, you can get something done for a few $100s.
But if you're
spending, $20,000 on a small campaign, I mean, that works out.
But if you're going to spend, $20,000 on a campaign and you want the ad to change every week, and you're going to have 4 pieces of creative, there's got to be enough meat on the bone for someone to actually start a creative agency that actually can make a living off this and not just earn pennies. So that means volume, lots of volume. And then when you're dealing with lots of volume, then does quality go down? So it's, there's a little horse trading, but I don't know. There's potentially, it's, here's the thing about that. And I heard someone say this recently, you can make a lot of money on things that are hard. And that's definitely a hard one. So if you're willing to do the work and put it in there, you probably can do very, very well. If you were to form an agency that did nothing but creative.
Yeah. We've been looking at, there's some pretty cool technology out there. We were looking at it from Veritonic, and they have some tools that actually you can run creative through their, AI platform, and it'll say, hey, if you're Allstate and you have 3 different ads that you think might work for a campaign, you can run them through their tools, and it'll give you an assessment based on all these different variables. Which is kind of interesting because it's a bit of a scientific way to assess different creative. And one of the things that we were looking at is maybe leveraging that for host read ads to say, hey, here's some feedback on your host read ad. Next time,
that's interesting.
You can tweak it a little bit, to make it a little bit more interesting or make it more engaging or, those types of things. So I think there's a ton of opportunity on the creative side to optimize.
Yeah. And as Tom said during his presentation at Podcast Movement, that the performance difference between a host-read ad and a good produced another host-read ad by someone third party, that delta in performance was pretty small. And
that was huge. Yeah,
that was huge. And I think, to be honest with you, I think I kind of shook my head the whole time he was talking about that, because we've done that a little bit in the past, and there was, we've seen good impact. So I guess I wasn't surprised, but it was nice to see it quantified. And
for sure, for me, I was expecting, because if you think about, like, let's say you're a buyer and you've got a host read ad, at $25, and you have a programmatic ad at, I don't know, 30-40% off of that rate. I was expecting to see kind of, that kind of variation in terms of the effectiveness, but it was great to see that, a good producer read ad was, not that far off performance wise, because I think that goes that's a positive thing when you talk about programmatic.
Yeah, because then we can drive up from 15. So what's the difference? Okay, if the documented difference is 10%. So if you're spending 25 on an ad, then logic would say we should be able to bring that ad in at 21, 22, and you get the same performance on the money spent. Because, you know, in the end, they're backing the numbers out. They're looking at how much they spend and how much of a ROI they've got. And I think they'll be fine. I think it'll help drive, if in other words, it all depends on creative execution, but if we can get creative execution up, we could drive programmatic CPMs up. Now, the media buyers don't want to hear that, but if they're getting the same performance, if they're getting good performance, then they should not have a problem paying.
Absolutely.
But we have to make
I was pretty, I was on the edge of my seat when Tom was doing that presentation. It was super interesting.
Yeah. So should we drop the term programmatic when it comes to referring to this? Like I think you alluded to, I think, Dave, is that it's got baggage with it, right? That isn't positive.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has, you know, some negative connotations, right, around just like, you know, race to the bottom in terms of rates, right, you know, that type of thing. I don't know what the right term is, right? Maybe we can come up with something together.
I don't know. I don't necessarily consider it a negative, at least from the content creator standpoint. If the ads are good and they're not getting complaints from their audiences and the advertisers are happy, why is there a dirty word? Because I don't think it's a race to the bottom anymore.
Yeah, but is it a perception of the buyers thinking that this is not premium inventory?
Well, that's the job of SoundStack and AdvertiseCast to reject that stuff.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it is changing. I mean, the CPMs have been going up, so. I mean,
And you know, we don't want to be in the residual market. You know, that's because every podcast listen is not like listening at 2:00 in the morning to radio. You know, so I don't know if I use the right word. What is the ads that run at 2:00 in the morning on radio? What's it called?
Remnant.
Yeah.
Remnant inventory.
Yeah,
right.
This is not remnant inventory.
Which is what's been historically associated with programmatic.
So I think that's the story we have to start mentioning is you're getting the value of a truly engaged listener with the ease of how you've bought, or maybe I shouldn't even say this, the ease of how you've bought remnant in the past, but you're going to get value. But I don't know. The stuff that we've been hearing has not sounded like remnant. We've been hearing Microsoft ads. We've heard.
Oh yeah.
You know,
Totally.
yeah.
Agree.
No, and the reality is, I think, Todd, that most of the brands that are doing programmatic in podcasts are bigger brands that have bigger budgets, want to control the messaging, and you know, yeah, you'll hear some, you know, smaller, I don't know, mom and pop regional stuff, but the lion's share is, you know, kind of blue chip, large brands.
But if I was a mom and pop, you know, I've had lots of people come to me over the years say, we want to focus on Seattle, or we want to focus on, you know, the northeastern sector, whatever it may be. You know, this is an opportunity where you could, as a regional advertiser, you could now start getting into some podcasts. Now, it's not going to cost them a lot, but at the same time,
Yeah, for sure.
you know, it will be fill that it may make up the difference between an 80% fill rate and 100% fill rate. If we get the local car dealers to run an ad, you know, again, they're going to run across 30 podcasts in the region to get what they want. But I think this is where we can start seeing us start to impact radio revenue.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, a few years back, we did some campaigns with some that were like those kind of regional targeted campaigns with some car dealership groups, and I kind of thought, gee, I wonder what regional car dealerships spend a year on advertising. And I looked it up in the context that, of course, in the podcast world, we're doing, you know, at the time, I don't know, it was not even $1 billion. And I think it was something like regional car dealers spend $12 billion a year on advertising.
Well, I have a
local
massive,
advertising. Right?
So unlocking those budgets is huge.
I have a very, very good friend, family friend. They've been in a used car sales business for 20 years. They buy across 4 radio stations. They spend over $200,000 a year on local radio advertising. So let's take 20 grand of that or 10 grand of that a year, and let's buy some podcasts in a regional way. And they try to reach like 7 counties. So it's like you just draw a circle 50 miles around their dealership. That's what they try to reach. So that's a pretty big area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of the DSPs today have the capabilities to do pretty granular geo-targeting, based on zip codes or counties or DMAs and all that good stuff. So that's definitely an untapped opportunity for kind of regional advertisers.
Go right down to a Nielsen region.
Mm-hmm.
Guys, where are we right now? Just to help everyone understand what the marketplace for this really looks like, is self-service programmatic versus hand-holding programmatic or sales rep managed programmatic. And is there a difference there? And are we even in the realm yet of pure auction-based buying yet?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, there definitely are there is that going on. But I think actually there was maybe even a Sounds Profitable article this week that we are kind of using the term programmatic as a bit of a catch-all. Like, for example, Megaphone has their MTM, which is now Spotify Audience Network. That is not programmatic. Like, that is them flighting ads on their own platform. There's nobody buying that via DSP. Like, the whole concept of programmatic is that it is somebody sitting at their desk, a buyer, either an agency or a brand buyer themselves, buying that, bidding on it, and buying the inventory. Right. I definitely think that in the podcast world, that is like probably the biggest area that's going to grow. We've had some conversations with some of the DSPs, like the Trade Desk and folks like that, and that's a big focus for them, is to get as much content as they can, because they're seeing more and more demand from those buyers to say, look, this is how we're buying a bunch of other media. We want to buy podcasts the same way. So I think it's just going to get, a lot more of that actual programmatic stuff, going and accelerating over the next little while.
So is that going to take time for the larger buyers to adapt to that? Because they've been used to having, a person come in and call on them to pitch opportunities, right?
I think it's purely a volume issue. When you get 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 10,000 shows, let's say between Libsyn and Blueberry, that have opted in to programmatic, then all of a sudden there is a much bigger pie of content for these. All of a sudden it's like, wow, there's some serious. And maybe it means to be more than 10,000. Maybe it needs to be 50,000 shows that's going to be in the pool. And I think once that's the case, what have they been buying now? They've been buying live streams, right? And what's the total number of live streams in space? I don't know what that number is, but I guarantee there's more podcasts than there are live streams. So
ones that have any audience.
Right. And so I think that all we need to do is now that, at least on my part, is we want to bring in as many podcasters to get on and make that inventory available. And the beauty is I don't have to tell a media buyer. A media buyer isn't going to tell me, well, we don't want your old inventory. We only want new episodes. I turn on 620 episodes of back catalog. Now, episode 1 that was recorded, or episode 3 that was recorded in 2004 is going to get 0. But it's turned on, right? It's there. It can be monetized. And that's a big piece too, is because oftentimes the media buyers on traditional buys, they don't want back catalog. They just want the fresh. So I think there's just a huge availability. You guys know how much inventory we're leaving on the table. I know how much.
Sure,
I know how many hundreds of millions of downloads that are not being monetized. Now, don't get me wrong. Not all of them want to be. Let's say 50% of them do. So let's say just from Blueberry alone, let's say there's 100 million impressions that could be monetized by the podcaster just flipping a switch. That changes the dynamic. You add Libsyn to this model, everyone else, and all of a sudden there is a true huge amount of content that can be bought and fairly well targeted.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the reality is, Rob, that these buyers who are used to buying other things via DSP, from their desk without talking to anybody, they are dying to get their hands on, like Todd said, a lot of scale, a lot of inventory. And I think that's a big push right now. I think the other thing that's keeping some of those kind of buyers on the sidelines is somewhat around, some of the concerns around brand suitability and brand safety. Mm-hmm. And there's tons of things in the works on that front. There's, I think I've talked to 3 or 4 different vendors that are essentially able to, kind of weed that stuff out so that when they're doing their programmatic buys, their ads are not going to land where they don't want them to land. And I think that being something that's very, easily accessible is going to open up a lot of those buys too. Because let's be honest, like there's a lot of podcasts. And if I was a buyer that has the choice of buying, specific, radio stations where there's, guidelines and things that govern what they can say and what they can't say versus hundreds of thousands of podcasts, like I might sway that way just to make sure I don't get in trouble. I think the brand safety piece, as that evolves, is going to really open up some of those budgets too.
Yeah, I really hate that word, to be honest with you. That's almost a 4-letter word for me, brand safety, because I look at how the podcasting space was built and what we did with advertising when brand safety, it was a different time, different sensibilities, different.
It's a reflection of how things have changed.
Yeah, and people's sensibilities, but some of those shows that were really out there on the fringe did the best. They
absolutely.
They really did. They rocked it. But you get someone's talking about a specific topic, and brands are now scared to death because all it takes is one tweet to say, "Oh my God, you're on this show."
Yeah, and we talked about this extensively in last week's episode of this show. That was related to brand safety and what there is some movement in the industry to identify that and to at least have knowledge of it before an advertiser makes a commitment.
But I will reach out to Adam and Dave if you guys are still listening. I will not allow nutrition labels for podcasts. Okay, so that to me raises the ire. I think what we can do is someone that wants to opt in, there can internally be a determination of where that show falls in the brand safety spectrum. Internally, that can be done. I never want to put a label on any show ever.
Well, it would be public.
I agree. I think the models that I think make the most sense that I've seen out there is, and again, let's keep in mind that there's brand safety and there's brand suitability. Brand safety, it's black or white. The brand safety, if it's unsafe, it's off the table. Like in a lot of these models, that stuff's never going to get ads delivered against it, period. And then if you think about brand suitability, let's call it there's, green, yellow, red. Green is like, no profanity, nothing controversial. Yellow is kind of in between, and red is like the edgier stuff. And like you said, Todd, a lot of that edgier stuff oftentimes drives the best results because the audience is like super engaged and whatnot. Right. But it's kind of like put it out there to the buyer to say, look, you can have your green, you can have your yellow, you can have your red. Different brands might have different appetites depending on where they want to land, and this is giving them the ability to do that. And that model I think is super interesting. But like, the safety versus suitability discussion is always an interesting one.
Yeah, and I think that there's going to be but we're going to have at some point, there's going to be something that will pop off. One of us will have a show that gets something in it that a brand is going to get some feedback on, and it'll bring this to a head. But, it's one thing. It's like when we started doing ads with the tech network, one of my requirements of that, and it's tech, right? So why do you need to be cussing during a tech show? So we're like, if you can't be, and this was in 2006, 2005, so if you can't not swear on your show, and then once in a while you'll say something, I'll even pop off on this show once in a while, I'll say something. If you can't keep your tongue in check, then you can't be part of the network. We can't run ads because we can't, even at that point, we are trying to be careful. So then your opportunity is you're going to have to do something else. And if you're worried about pissing off an advertiser, then value for value is your model. You go and ask your listeners for a donation. You figure out a different way to monetize. So it'll be up to the content creator on which way they want to go. And obviously, there's some shows out there that they know that they would be demonetized immediately because the advertisers say, "Oh no, we can't be associated with this because you're saying that." Then the podcaster has to understand themselves what they're setting themselves up for, and if they want to be freewheeling and say whatever they want to say, and they want to get that, if you at Advertise Cast or us or Soundstack says, "Oh, this show's a little edgy," it needs to put it in that edgy category. Again, I hate putting labels on shows because the shows can change from episode to episode.
No, for sure. Yeah, and that's exactly. And when I was talking about that model before of like the yellow, green, red, and unsafe, I mean, I've seen models that look at that by episode, so that you might have a show that's green, 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 and they go off the rails one episode, and that one episode is all of a sudden, in a different bucket. Yeah, and it's funny, Todd. I mean, ironically enough, I think I've had more since we kind of got into the whole programmatic game here. I've probably had more issues of podcasters complaining about ads that they don't want than brands complaining about shows that they don't want.
That's funny.
Right. It's almost like ad suitability is probably the bigger challenge for us than brand suitability on the show side.
In our version 1 of our rollout, we excluded 7 or 8 categories. We didn't give the podcasters a choice to pick their categories. But in round 2, if they want to have marijuana or CBD, or if they want to have politics, they can turn those categories on. One show that came back said, "Hey, we can't run right now because I was getting fast food on a show that I'm talking about weight loss." And so I understand he's going to want to turn off fast food. And so he'll be able to come back when we put out MVB2 for at least what we've done. And it's just growing. I think we're all going to figure out over time. And the main thing I'm took a hands off is I'm going to let Soundstack worry about the management of the ads, and if we have an issue, we'll talk to them, and that's what they do for a living. It's just like you guys. That's what you guys do. I don't want to do that, at least on programmatic. So,
yeah, and on the topic of suitability, I think that's a pretty big topic area too, and I was wanting to kind of dig into that a little bit too, and how that suitability is determined, right? What's the methodology of how suitability is actually determined? And I think, and Dave, I don't know what the companies you've talking to are basing this on, but the importance of transcripts are increasingly becoming important from a suitability evaluation standpoint, targeting. I mean, as we start thinking about privacy and we start thinking about the sensitivity of IP, how important do you guys think transcripts are going to be in unlocking these needs in the market?
I mean, I think transcripts are always the basis for all of this stuff. I think the most interesting models that I've seen around this brand suitability are the ones that use the transcripts, score it automatically, AI, scoring, and then anything that's flagged as like a high risk gets manually reviewed, or like has a secondary, kind of review process to it, where somebody goes, "Oh, somebody said their portfolio got murdered." Okay, well that's not, that's a finance term, that's not talking about murder. So we're going to make that one, instead of red, it's, green or yellow or whatever. So, I think that's the most interesting one, because we've actually run a test with one of those platforms where we said, score it, and then do the secondary process. And it was interesting to see, it was actually fairly accurate. There was, the thing that you saw most often was something they thought was red got backed off to like a green or yellow, just by virtue of, and you can imagine all the different terms out there that people are going to use that aren't, as controversial when you have a human listen to it and go, okay, well, the context is a lot different than what the AI thought it was.
So how do we do the opposite though? I'm more worried about the creator than the advertisers. So how do we protect the listeners as well from getting these ads that are, well, not appropriate? Because some advertisers are going to push the. How do we punish a company that puts a gambling ad in the DSP that is been marked for hotels or something like that, and they've classified it wrong? How where's the reverse? Where can the punishment come back to the advertiser?
I mean, there's got to be smarter people out there than me that can solve that problem. But it's when you think about Todd, when you think about the way that this whole thing works, is I could have a podcast that I put out there, and there's 500 downloads that happen today, and there's 3 ad spots. There could literally be hundreds of different ads going
That's
in.
right.
On those 500 downloads.
That's right.
Depending on where you are, who you are, how many times you've heard a certain ad on different shows, on your show. And so it's a very, dynamic situation that somebody, needs to deal with. And I'm not sure. I really don't.
So it's almost like, okay, you're asking us to be safe and provide content that's not going to hurt your brand. Well, there has to be some other reciprocation, and I'm sure it's just going to be outliers that's going to cause issues. But there has to be some sort of, and I don't know if anyone's ever talked about this, but how do I protect
the brand of the podcast?
That's
I mean,
right.
I think it should fall on the DSPs, right? Like if they have, some way or some review process. Now, obviously, they want to give their buyers and users as much flexibility and freedom as they can, but have something in there to say, look, somebody ran this political ad and they categorized it as food, right? Like that's a problem.
It's a problem.
And like you said, Todd, it's kind of funny where we're talking so much about, we want to make sure that these ads don't end up on a sketchy podcast. Well, what about a sketchy ad ending up on my non-sketchy podcast?
Right. Yeah.
It's
You're running a conservative podcast, and you also all of a sudden get or vice versa, and you get a opposite. Yeah. It's like, okay, did you want that ad?
I'd love
That's
to
the same
hear.
thing that happened with with the liquor brand that was
Right.
advertising on a sobriety podcast.
Yeah.
Right.
And that was not so good. I mean, I'd love to hear from a programmatic, expert around how all these things interplay and what they think might be a good solution here, and who should be, accountable. I mean, ultimately, I think it's the person who's going and flighting that ad that should be accountable. And accidents happen, right? And now I think maybe, I don't know if it's a bigger issue, but it's part of the issue is that I don't know if you guys have ever reviewed the IAB categories. I have. I'm just a total nerd, or I was using this, but I have it on my desk right now. Like it's literally on my desktop on my computer.
Yeah.
They're not great. Like,
No.
Where do you put certain things, right? Like,
Well,
I don't know.
That needs to be reviewed
Cannabis
and updated.
is
Right.
legal in many states. Where do you categorize that? There isn't a category.
So what we have to do is we have to go back to IB and say, hey,
Yeah.
and we're both members, so we have to go back and say, hey, we need these additional ad categories, and go to that specific committee and say, okay, it's time to expand, and maybe that's part of the. Maybe we have to do our due diligence and go back to IB and say, hey, this isn't granular enough.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, the categories are, they need to keep pace with the times, right? And a little bit more. But I do think, there's some mistakes, there's maybe some bad actors, and there may be just some kind of mechanisms or policing that needs to be done in the middle there somewhere.
So, I'm sure there's folks listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this specific topic. So we brand safety from a podcast standpoint to the vendor has been talked to death, but again, and I'm sure it's just going to be onesie twosies, but those are the ones that always make headlines. Look at the thing that happened, like Rob said, what was it? Which company advertised on
Wild
that?
Turkey.
Yeah, Wild Turkey on that show on Spotify. Well, they made news, It wasn't good for Wild Turkey. It wasn't good for the podcaster. So in essence,
I don't know. It probably was good for both of them, but
Well.
it's just a matter of your perspective on it.
Right.
But it's not good for the industry because it was obviously a classic example of mistargeting.
Yeah.
I mean, even if one potential ad buyer sees that and goes, "Oh no, I'm not getting involved with that." Like it's not good. It's not good for the industry, like you said, Rob.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that podcasters have always thought about their audience first. And I think that is the other thing that I like to think about too in the context of all this is at the end of the day, this medium values the connection between listeners and the creators, right? And advertisers have always been kind of like, welcomed in the door on a limited way, right? And brought into the relationship in a gradual and fragile approach, right? And so I would love to see that level of responsibility continuing, right, to some degree as we move into another phase in podcasting with heightened commercialization of this medium. And that may be too much to ask for in the scheme of things, and because we've certainly seen some players in the industry start to play with ad models that are mirroring what we've experienced with radio, and that's not good.
The desire to make the almighty buck is very, very strong, and it's the desire
it's been growing.
and the desire to raise revenues on all points is very strong. But we've all had ad deals come in from a vendor that I look at this and I go, it just reading it, I get a bad taste in my mouth, and I'll be like, no, we're not going to present this to the content creator. I don't care how much money you have. I'm walking away from this. And because I know the content creator is going to see it and they're going to go, that's sketch. So what happens now when some of those same players come in and their ads are on borderline, let's say they're doing some sort of lead magnet for whatever they're trying to sell. Some of that stuff can be a little sketchy. And
right.
I think this is where there has to be almost, I don't want to say you have to earn a trust score or something like that, but there has to be something set, because the desire to make money is going to make most people say, okay, we'll run that. That, it doesn't matter. It's just going to run across a number of shows. No one's going to notice. We'll spend their $5,000. And
yeah, which is exactly what happened in radio,
right,
on the commercial radio side.
So I think if we can keep that junk out, what that does is two things, really, is it builds podcaster confidence that this stuff that's going to be presented to their audience is going to be palatable. And number two, we can drive CPMs up because the value we're not giving those content creators this sketchy remnant stuff that you hear at 2:00 in the morning on talk radio. So I think that is, if we can figure out where that happy medium is, then we'll drive CPMs up, keep the value of the audience up, keep the audiences happy. Obviously, there's the other piece on podcasters keeping the brands happy, but it's a two-way street here, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a changing time in the podcasting medium as we push in this direction, and I think that the industry is more and more coming together. I would say it is helpful that the Sounds Profitable entity now exists to help guide this this pathway in the industry, and we should probably have Brian and Tom back on the show at some point to kind of elaborate on some of these things too, as we bring the industry together to come up with best practices in this particular area. I don't know, Dave, do you have any other parting thoughts or things that you wanted to share?
I think you said, Rob, it's this is kind of a new paradigm in podcasting. Like, even from my own personal perspective, like seeing that this is coming, like I've been reading books about,
right.
Programmatic, educating myself and over the last several years. And I think it's, like you said, Tom and Brian and Sounds Profitable, kind of educating people about, hey, here's what this means. Here's what the industry is doing. Here's, what can happen in the future. I think that's key, is everybody kind of learning and understanding, what this all means, and continuing to help drive the industry forward in terms of revenue, but at the same time, making sure we don't, kind of harm, what we've got going on in the space in terms of like the audience engagement, great quality content, and that type of thing, and kind of there's a balance there somewhere.
Because I feel that 5 years ago, podcasters would not be as accepting as they are, what we're seeing so far. And now we have an opportunity. And if we screw this up, we're going to set ourselves back 2 or 3 years. So I think we have to, really focus on this and make sure that we're delivering the best experience we can. Because if we do, we build trust in the content creators to do this. And I've been very frank to all of our content creators that are participating now. I'm like, you hear a bad ad, I want to know immediately. I want you to, my telephone number is public, my email is public. You email me that, and it doesn't matter if it's a Saturday, Sunday, we're going to react. Because it's really, it's really important to me that we maintain the podcasters' trust, because if they trust us, then they build confidence in the space, and they'll encourage fellow podcasters to say, hey, you can turn this on at Libsyn, you can turn this on at Blueberry, you can turn this on wherever, whoever else has Programmatic, and be self-confident that we're not going to piss their audience off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Todd, I want to change the subject actually in the last couple of minutes here too, but I'm sure both of you guys have been hearing talk about what's rumored going on with Patreon.
They had
I don't know if you wanted to share anything on that, or if you've had any thoughts on what's going on with Patreon.
17% reduction in workforce as of today, 80 less employees.
Yeah, and their rumored involvement in the underage content on their platform. Yeah, I don't know if you heard about that.
No,
I didn't see that. No, I just saw the layoff news.
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk online about that platform having issues, some potential legal issues with underage content being offered on their platform.
You would think that they would. Yeah. That would be something that they would be hot and heavy on.
They are, but I'm also seeing a lot of talk in the industry of people moving to other platforms off of Patreon because of these rumors. I don't know if they're substantiated yet or not. I don't want to substantiate anything that isn't substantiated yet, but that's a hot thing that's brewing in the industry right now.
Well, that's why my listeners can contribute on PayPal. I don't need, and same for this show. We don't we don't have an integration with Patreon.
Right.
But it is interesting though, because when I was out at Dragon Con, everybody was talking about Patreon, and I'm like, why? Why do you need Patreon when you can do this yourself without being in? You get less money taken away from you. Yes, they've given you some tools, but this is fully capable of being able to do your own rewards on your own site without having to involve a third party. Mm-hmm. But it's just easy. That's probably the big reason why they're using it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that there has been a shift in the online content space towards premium content more and more. I mean, I think we're seeing movement in that direction that's been going on for a couple of years now. Private content, that kind of stuff. It's been developing.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot more options now too, right? For that, there's the Apple subscriptions, there's third-party tools like we've got Glow, there's Supercast, there's all kinds of different platforms that you can kind of facilitate and actually facilitate somewhat of a smoother experience on the podcast side than you could via Patreon. So
it's also
more options.
It's also available in Spotify too. You can do it on third parties into Spotify as well. So if you are looking to move beyond Patreon as this scandal develops, there are other alternatives out there.
So Rob, anything else going on in the space that we should talk about before we get out of here today?
I think we filled our listeners up with lots of things to think about when it comes to advertising.
Yeah,
most definitely. But I don't know. Is there anything else you can think of, or Dave? Is there anything else?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Well,
okay.
I think the main thing too was, I don't know if you listened to Adam and Dave on the last Podcast 2.0 show, They made a couple of minor references to us, but I think that what we need to be careful of is applying labels to shows. I get real worried about that type of a scenario where all of a sudden a show is labeled a certain way, and if it's one thing to do something internally when it comes to advertising and having a personal conversation with a content creator, but putting a label on someone's show and having that public, I'm very much against that. It really kind of goes against the open nature of the space, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And there was a little hint, and when we were talking to the gentleman from Oxford Road, he made a comment about that, and basically a nutrition label for podcasts, and I it really kind of, I sat there thinking about it as we were having that conversation, and that really just grinds me a little bit the wrong way, especially when it comes to independent content creators. Because let's be frank, there's probably 50% of people that listen to this show that have no desire whatsoever to monetize their podcast. And
well, Todd, I think he was really kind of referring to more of kind of like the brand suitability stuff.
Well, I know that's exactly
like
what
a scoring system for that, right?
But I'd hate to see something ever come out where all of a sudden there was some third party that is doing a scoring of shows, and that becomes some sort of public.
Oh yeah.
Public thing that would, to me, it's like that's all of a sudden you're being, who's the one to judge about one's content? If we want to remain to be open, there should not be a score we put. It's not like podcasts are going to make you fat. It's not like we're going to have too much sodium in our in our podcast
like a movie,
consumption.
like PG-13 or NC-17, or whatever,
right.
Right.
That makes me, when we start wanting to talk about putting labels on shows, that just really, it doesn't set right. Now, again, a company can do whatever they want internally for a suitability for if they want to do advertising, but I think most shows know whether or not they're suitable for advertising based upon the content that they do. I really do.
I think, Todd, that the area that you're probably most concerned about, and I would be as well, is that technology being used to put certain types of shows in certain kind of cultural buckets, right?
I agree.
For discrimination against or canceling or that type of thing. Right?
Yeah. So again, I think that we all have to, maintain the. If we didn't make it clear last show that we're about open and inclusivity, then there's no show that we've ever done that couldn't make it more clear than that.
Right.
We understand, again, and going back, your opinion's your opinion, and what you think about content's content, but we're not here to address that.
Right.
There's lots of shows that are going to be talking about other shows' content. We're here just more to keep the space open, and I don't want to be a judge of anything.
Right.
Yeah. Our CEO Brad says we're liberated syndication.
That's right.
Syndication.
Well, our terms of service are pretty clear about that too. So
yeah,
right. Yeah.
And I think we all run on that same model. So I think that, or at least a lot of us do.
Yeah.
I would hope
Can't
so.
say everybody.
No, but I think probably the majority of at least podcast hosts. At least I hope they stand for the same type of, open, inclusive models. But all right, well, I guess we can get out of here. Rob, you want to give some 411 on how to reach out to you?
I can be reached on Twitter at Rob Greenlee, and you can certainly send me an email to robg@lipson.com. And Dave, why don't you share how you might want to be found?
Yeah, it's real simple. Just dave@advertisecast.com. You can reach out anytime. Thanks for having me on the show, guys. It was fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm Todd at blueberry.com, at Geek News on Twitter, and we'll be back here next Wednesday. And I might be able.
We were back here on Saturday.
I might be able to reveal where my passport's going to be taking me in mid-October. So
Oh,
Yeah, waiting for an airline ticket booking to make it official. So
okay. So you're going to share it at the next episode? Of the show? Is that what
potentially yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So we'll make sure that we're and I'm starting to see a list of other people that are going to be there, and that's going to be where they have a conversation in the show in itself. So
I would imagine so. Yes.
Nice.
all right, everyone. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next week. Everyone, take care.
Thanks,
Okay.
guys.
Thanks, guys.
Oh, that worked really well. That covered up half our face here.
He just covered up Dave.
That's right. Let's see if I can do this one. There we go.